Good morning, everyone. I'm Andrew Redmond. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute here at the Wilson Center, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here in person and to a large crowd that we have watching online. We're really pleased this morning to have this opportunity to have a conversation about poverty reduction and inequality reduction in Mexico, which is such a critical topic and one that has been really... Inequality and poverty are long-standing challenges for Mexico. All of you know that. The governor certainly knows that. And the challenge of inequality and poverty, of course, predates the current administration. It is also certainly not unique to Mexico. President López Obrador did make reducing inequality and poverty a key plank of his successful presidential campaign and of his administration. His social programs, including Sembrando Vida and Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, aim to reduce poverty and inequality. Unfortunately, the latest data from INEGI shows that poverty increased from 43.2% in 2016 to 43.9% in 2020, which means about 44% of Mexico's population, or around 55 million people, live below the poverty line, and 11 million live in extreme poverty. So the main question, the main focus of today's program really is on that. How do we achieve this longstanding objective? How do we reduce levels of poverty and inequality in order to create prosperity for all Mexicans? And in particular, since we have the presence of Governor Murat, what are the lessons that maybe can be learned from the Oaxaca experience that could be applied elsewhere? And elsewhere might be elsewhere in Mexico or in other countries facing the same challenge. So this morning we're going to have three presentations, starting with Nabor Cruz Marcelo, who's Executive Director of the National Council for the Evaluation of Social Development Policy, or CONEVAL, in Mexico. And he'll give us a sense of where Mexico stands in terms of poverty levels based on CONEVAL's 2020 report, and hopefully share some previews of the forthcoming report, which will come out in 2023. We'll then have remarks from Dr. Susan Parker, who's a professor of public policy at the University of Maryland, and she'll put this in a global context, sharing her research findings, best practices, and experiences from Mexico and elsewhere. And then finally, we'll hear from Governor Murat, who will talk about his accomplishments in Oaxaca and how his efforts have indeed led to significant reduction in poverty and extreme poverty in his state. We'll have an opportunity to take questions from the audience, both in person and online. If you're watching us online and you have questions for the governor, for either of the other presenters, please either email them to mexico@wilsoncenter.org or tag us on Twitter @Mexico Institute. What I'll do now is introduce our two virtual panelists, Dr. Cruz and Dr. Parker, and then before Governor Murat speaks, I will introduce the governor. Nabor Cruz Marcelo was appointed by President López Obrador to serve as Executive Secretary of the National Council for the Evaluation of Social Development Policy in 2019. He's currently a professor in the graduate program in economics at UNAM and a member of the National System of Researchers. Dr. Cruz holds a PhD, master's, and bachelor's degree in economics from UNAM in Mexico. In 2012, his doctoral thesis on income distribution and the development model in Mexico was awarded the annual prize for economic research, Maestro Jesus Silva Herzog, granted by the Instituto de Investigaciones Económicas. Dr. Susan Parker is a professor of public policy at the University of Maryland, College Park. She's also Associate Director of the Maryland Population Research Center and a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development. She was previously a professor of economics at CIDE in Mexico City, and she's currently an affiliated professor with CIDE. Among other outlets, her research has been published in the American Economic Journal, Economic Policy International Economic Review, Journal of Political Economy, the Journal of Economic Literature, and the Journal of Human Resources. Dr. Parker holds a PhD and an MA in economics from Yale and a BA in economics and mathematics from Franklin and Marshall College.
¿Qué tal? Muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Me da muchísimo gusto saludarlos.
Good morning to all of you. I'm so pleased to greet you. Let me greet Andrew Rudman and Governor Alejandro Murat. I'm so pleased to share this panel with Dr. Susan Parker And well, on behalf of CONEVAL, let me express my gratitude for inviting me to be a part of this event. Let me now share my screen with you so we can start the presentation. We have had some problems with the audio. I was unable to hear the introduction, but let me go into the direct presentation. CONEVAL has among its standards the periodic measurement of the multi-dimensional poverty levels for the country, for Mexico, and the 32 states of the state and municipal governments. I have this presentation today for you. I will give you a brief outline in regards to the methodology for the multi-dimension of poverty that is conducted by CONEVAL. And then I will share the results that at the state and municipal level we have published for the case of the state of Oaxaca in Mexico. These are the two basic standards that are relevant to be done by CONEVAL. The National Council of Social Policy Development, CONEVAL, was created in 2004 by the General Social Development Law. And then we have the policy of social development by the federal government. And also we have implemented, and after its first publication in 2009, we have to publish the poverty estimates, which is a multi-dimension perspective. Within the next slide, you can now see the 6 dimensions, the 6 elements that CONEVAL uses in order to measure in a multi-dimension way the poverty levels for the case of Mexico. Education backlog, access to health services, access to Social Security, 2 areas that have to do with the housing sphere, quality and spaces of the housing, and basic health services that houses receive, such as water supply or energy, sewage. And it is along this line that these 2 lines are trying to approach the accessibility to the social rights of housing of people in Mexico. And finally, a last element that has to do with access to nutrition and quality nutrition. These dimensions from CONEVAL, we consider that they are just an approach to the exercise of the social rights of the population in our country. This is complemented with the variable of income. This variable has different sources of income, such as income given labor, remittances, social programs, transfers, and condition transfers, and transfers in kind. The 6 dimensions that I have just brought to your attention are part of the basic methodology that allows CONEVAL to identify the poverty information by state every 2 years, and also through the municipal governments every 5 years, as a result of the information collected by the National Institute of Statistics and Geography in Mexico, INEGI. Now, to go directly into the figures that we have shared with you in August of last year, this is a year ago, in regards to a series of the levels of poverty and the missing elements that I have shared with you for all of the state in Mexico and the federal states. For the case of Oaxaca, let me move to the following slide, because I can see that we can see it more directly as we see what has to do with the poverty reduction in the percentage points of the population in the state of Oaxaca in a condition of poverty. In 2016, 88% of the population was in a multi-dimension poverty condition. Then it went down to 43.7%, and now it is at 61.7%. It is worth to mention that while the national trajectory between 2018 and 2020 was a 2% increase in the national average, we went from 41.9% in 2018 to 43.9% of the total of the population in Mexico in a poverty multi-dimension condition. In the case of Oaxaca, but about 11 states of Mexico had reductions in the poverty levels between 2018 and 2020. It is worth mentioning that even within the context of the health emergency and the economic contraction that Mexico had during 2020, we reached a reduction of the multi-dimension poverty levels between 2018 and 2020. For the case of Oaxaca, we basically set a reduction trend of almost 7% points between 2016 and 2020. If we see this, given the 6 basic social levels, we will see that most of them are showing a reduction trend within these past 3 years, and they cover from 2016 to 2020. We still have here a higher percentage of the population that has a greater lack of having access to health services. This is the lack that the highest percentage of the population has reported for the national average, which is about 51% of the population. For the case of the state of Oaxaca, it's 73% of the population for 2020 is showing that they have no access to Social Security. There is a reduction in 2020 of 7 points percent in the state of Oaxaca. And we have also relevance given the basic housing services. And there is also almost 10% between 2016 and 2020. So in the lack of education and lack of quality nutrition, there is an increase in this last one, but fortunately, it was not a relevant increase as it was the case within the context of the 2009 crisis, when between 2008 and 2010, we had a relevant increase in the lack of access to quality nutrition of about 4% points. In Oaxaca, from 2016 to 2020, there is even a reduction of almost 2 percentage points, but it is retaining a third of its population with having lacking quality nutrition. One of the multi-dimension poverty measurement elements that CONEVAL has developed for Mexico is that we can see the levels of poverty by area of residence, by groups of population groups. In the different areas, in the rural area, there is a reduction of almost 10 points in the percentage of population of people that inhabit the rural areas in the country. Let us recall that rural areas definition are those population areas that have no more than 2,500 inhabitants. These are population groups with very low levels of population. Let me reiterate that there is almost a reduction of 10 points between 2016 and 2020. There is an increase between 2018 and 2020, but if we see it between 2016 and 2020, there is a reduction trend. Now, if we see the population groups here, Oaxaca had a reduction trend, just like the rest of the country, in regards to the percentage of population above 65 years of age. So 71% of the population in a poverty situation above 65 years of age to a 58% in 2020. Even if we see it through a younger of 18, Oaxaca is one of the few states in the country that during this same period of time had a reduction in regards to poverty, reduction of boys, girls, adolescents, and young people below 18. Also for indigenous language speakers and also disabled persons between 2016 and 2020, we can see a reduction trend in the poverty levels. Now, I was mentioning to you that CONEVAL is also in charge of reviewing the estimates of poverty at the municipal level. This is the political administrative level area that we have in Mexico to measure. We have about 2,466 municipalities with poverty levels estimations. Let me share this map with you in which we are reporting how it has been the evolution between 2010, 2015, and 2020, the poverty levels, multi-dimensional poverty levels at the municipal level. As a matter of fact, during this decade, in these three terms that CONEVAL has published, the multi-dimension poverty levels and extreme poverty levels, we're still focusing the levels of poverty in the southeastern part of Mexico, but there are areas in the Yucatan Peninsula, in the Quintana Roo, and where Cancun is located, and the northeastern part of the country, where over 60% of the population is in a condition of multi-dimension poverty conditions. So we focus our attention for the municipalities of the state of Oaxaca. Here we have this image in regards to the evolution of the poverty levels between 2010, 2015, and 2020. What can we identify from this decade? Well, between 2010 and 2020, 354 municipalities presented reductions in the percentage of persons in a poverty situation. It is along this sense that if it is true that in 2010 there were 228 municipalities with percentages of poverty above 90% levels, in 2020 this figure was down to 175 municipalities, being Santa Maria Temascalapa, the municipality that had the highest reduction, poverty reduction in terms of percentual points between 2010 and 2020, 2010 and 2020 in the levels of poverty. Now, if we look at the number of persons, not percentage, in a situation of poverty, obviously the capital of the state, Oaxaca de Juárez, is reporting for 2020 as the municipality with the highest number of persons in a poverty situation, with about 93,304 persons in such a condition. But it is also worth to mention that between 2010 and 2020, there was a reduction of almost 30,000 persons that had a poverty condition in the case of the capital city of the state. In 2020, we have a reduction of almost 13,000 people in regards to those that were in a poverty situation. In this list, we can see that most of the municipalities between 2015 and 2020, even being the ones that had the highest number of persons in multidimensional poverty conditions, in most of the cases, there is a reduction in absolute numbers of persons in a poverty condition. Now, if we see the persons in a extreme poverty condition, you may realize that in 2010, the vast majority of the municipalities of the state of Oaxaca were placing over 45% of its population in a condition of extreme poverty. There were 271 municipalities that had this particular feature, but only 32 municipalities of Oaxaca in 2010 had 10% or less in an extreme poverty condition. I find that this map allows us to see the strong impact that since 2010 has taken place in Oaxaca in terms of persons in extreme poverty condition persons. Now, what we can see is a condition in a reduction in a relevant number of municipalities in extreme poverty condition. Basically, in 505 municipalities of the state have shown reductions in the percentage of population in extreme poverty situation between 2010 and 2020. If we visualize this also within the list and municipalities with the highest number of inhabitants, not percentage, but absolute number of persons in an extreme poverty situation, we can see that San Juan Bautista Tuxtepec has 29,910 persons, and it is the municipality with the highest number of persons under such condition. If there has been a trend in the three first municipalities of an increase of extreme poverty persons, even the city, capital city, Oaxaca de Juarez, that went from 9,630 to almost 21,605 in 2020. So clearly, this increase basically within these municipalities where the highest number of persons in extreme poverty condition is given to what happened with the economic contraction of income during the second and the third quarter of the 2020, and that is when we had the survey of the home expenses and also the population census, and both that data collections allows CONEVAL to carry out these measurements at the municipal level. If we look at the 5 municipalities with the highest percentage of persons in a poverty condition or extreme poverty, if it's true that we have had reductions, there is still a list of municipalities that have over 98, 99% of its population in a poverty condition. And here we have municipalities that have about from 82 to 84% of its population in extreme poverty condition. But we have the counterpart, which is those 5 municipalities with the lowest percentage of persons in a poverty condition and extreme poverty. As we have municipalities in Oaxaca with 77, 78, or 84% of its population in extreme poverty condition, we also have a group of municipalities with no more than 3% of its population in an extreme poverty condition. And we also have this group of municipalities, which are those that have the lowest percentage of its population in a multi-dimension poverty condition. Truly, Oaxaca is a state that is quite heterogeneous, not only in economic development, but also in its poverty levels. And here we can see this contrast. We have some municipalities that had an increase. This municipality that had an increase of 52 percentage points between 2010 and 2020 of the percentage of its population in a situation of poverty. But we have these other municipalities that had a strong reduction in the same term, which is San Raimundo Jalpan, and from 2010 to 2020, it had a reduction of 36 points in its multi-dimension poverty levels. Now, to conclude my presentation, I wanted to include the labor poverty report, which is a complementary indicator that CONEVAL manages on a quarterly basis. And this is our short-term indicator that allows us to see, taking into account the labor income of individuals, what is the percentage that has the possibility of acquiring the food staple. Now, this is the aggregated data. If you take this into account in 2020, in accordance to the third quarter of this very year, 2020, there was a strong increase in terms of labor poverty in Mexico. We went from 36.3% to almost 46% of the population in a labor poverty condition. And from that point on, it's been a cyclic recovery trend. The last data is for the second quarter of 2020. The national average is 38.3% of the population that is under this condition. For the case of Oaxaca, basically the data previous to the beginning of the pandemic placed 58.3% of the population in a poverty labor condition. We can see how from this peak right here in the third quarter of 2018, we had a cyclic reduction trend of this indicator from 8 percentage points between the third and the quarter of 2018 and the first quarter of 2020. That is the beginning of the pandemic. During the second quarter of 2020, we had the economic contraction at the world level, at the local level. And from this point on, there is a cyclic process of a certain initial recovery. And this takes place with a labor poverty increase in 2021 But by the end of this year and during the first 2 quarters of 2022, we have a recovery process of a reduction of labor poverty levels. And the last available data during the second quarter of 2022, we placed levels of labor poverty basically close to the ones that we had previous to the beginning of the pandemic. That means there's been a cyclic recovery process, not only of jobs recovery, but also poverty recovery in Oaxaca after 2 years of the beginning of the pandemic. In general terms, what we can share with you on behalf of CONEVAL, there has been an advancement trend in 4 of the 6 levels of lacks that we identify at CONEVAL in the multidimensional levels between 2016 and 2020.
Pobreza multidimensional para la población
Are
mayor.
relevant advances for the population of people above 65 years of age with a reduction of 13 percentage points. Let me mention that is meaningful from the statistical perspective, and there is this reduction between 2010 and 2020 of 554 municipalities that presented a reduction in percentage points of the persons in a poverty condition. There are steps taken in regards to the lack of housing, but Oaxaca is the second state in regards to social backlog, which is another indicator that we developed at CONEVAL to visualize some of the lacks that we use for multi-dimension poverty levels measurement. But it seems that in the projection of what Oaxaca needs for the following years is to continue focusing the public policies to continue reducing the social backlog, not only at the state and municipal level, but also as a locality. And as I have mentioned, there's been a recovery process in the levels of labor poverty. Let me conclude by saying this and reiterate that the case of Oaxaca is truly quite an enriching example given the evolution of multidimensional poverty levels, not only at the state aggregate, but also within the municipalities, our over 500 municipalities in the state of Oaxaca. There are some municipalities that had strong poverty, multi-dimension poverty reductions, and others have a constant, and also the regional and territorial disaggregation and breakdown allows us to analyze the figures. And well, we have at the CONEVAL, we complement the public policies at the federal, state, and municipal level in order to face poverty phenomena. And we all agree that this is a multi-dimension phenomena. I end by saying this, and I thank you for your kind attention.
Gracias, Doctor. And now we will, I'd like to give the floor, give the microphone, so to speak, to Dr. Parker. Dr. Parker, can you hear us? Okay, it's not Friday the 13th, but... Dr. Parker, can you hear us now?
We're sorry, this is the interpretation booth. We cannot hear.
Oh.
Good morning. Our apologies because we cannot hear you. I was waiting until you would tell me that I could start my speech. Good morning to all of you. I'm pleased to greet Mr. Rodman, Alejandro Murat, Governor, and Dr. Cruz, and those of you that are listening to us today in person or through Zoom.
to deliver my remarks in English. And again, thank you very much to the Mexican Institute and the Wilson Center. So I'm very happy to participate in this panel on such an important topic with esteemed participants and experts in the field. So I'm just going to provide some brief remarks on three sort of related topics, sort of elaborating what happened to poverty in Oaxaca, a bit about why it happened, and potentially what can be done better. How can these sort of positive trends be continued? Okay, so first of all, we heard a very clear presentation from Dr. Cruz about what happened to poverty. I'm going to concentrate on the period 2016 to 2020. So it's quite impressive, the decrease in poverty that you see in Oaxaca over this period. So using the multidimensional indicators that Dr. Cruz presented so clearly to us, you see a pretty large decrease in overall poverty of about 10%. So from about 68% to 61%. There's an even larger proportional decrease in the population extreme poverty from 24.3% to 20.6% of the population. So that's a 15% decrease. So it's a particularly impressive fall in extreme poverty. Now, it's really quite notable, as I think Dr. Cruz was partly discussing. It's notable because there are a lot of reasons to think that poverty would have increased during this period in Oaxaca. One, because of the pandemic, so which had immediate effects on the economy and unemployment. A second factor why I would have thought that poverty would increase was that during this period, Prospera, which was the federal large-scale conditional cash transfer program, was suddenly eliminated by the federal government. This was a program that provided cash transfers to 7 million households in all of Mexico in extreme poverty. There were substantial transfers, about $40 a month. In the case of Oaxaca, there were 40% at the time that Prospera was eliminated. There 40% of households were receiving these cash transfers, and they were sort of suddenly rolled back. There is a replacement program, the Becas Benito Juarez, but so far that's been covering fewer households in extreme poverty, according to my calculations. So because of all these factors, in fact, we would have expected an increase in poverty. And as Dr. Cruz mentioned, in fact, there was an increase overall in poverty in Mexico. And many, many states in Mexico showed an increase in poverty over this period. But Oaxaca is different. Oaxaca showed a decrease in the proportion in poverty. This is clearly really excellent news, and congratulations are for sure due to the governor and his team for these achievements. Now I want to switch and talk a bit about how this was achieved, and I know we're going to hear more about that, a lot more details from the governor. So I'm going to sort of just speculate a bit. So from what I sort of researched about the poverty strategy in Oaxaca, and what I can see is sort of a lot of things to like about the strategy being pursued. So in particular, targeting resources to the poor, to the poorest municipalities. I like also the use of data. So I understand that the strategy in Oaxaca using data to identify where the poor are located, to identify the poorest municipalities so as to target actions and social programs, the use of data to see what are the main deprivations that lead to poverty, and in fact, and to target those services. So for instance, one of the main reasons that overall poverty improved in Oaxaca was through a very large improvement in the provision of basic household services, including running water. So the government of Oaxaca could identify that using the data that is being produced by NEHI and CONEVAL. So this, generally speaking, then I would say targeting resources to the poor and using data to identify what the poor need are basic instruments for reducing poverty. I also want to give a lot of credit to CONEVAL, who's sort of providing, along with the NEHI, the data that are being so effectively used in Oaxaca. CONEVAL has been a real pioneer in the area of implementing multidimensional poverty and, of course, promoting program evaluation, which I'll say a bit more in a minute. And it's sort of a great example of coordination between federal and state areas of government. Okay, so lastly, I'll turn to a few ideas about where there might be sort of room for improvement or how to continue these sort of very positive trends. And again, this is sort of based on what what I sort of could learn on my own, and I'm sure we'll hear more detail from the governor. But I think I would like to see some more micro level evaluations of the different programs that are making up the anti-poverty strategy in Oaxaca. So I understand there are a number of different initiatives, school breakfast programs, investments in households, investments in the economy. But what I'd like to see is sort of more evaluations of the impacts of these different components. So, not just how many school meals are provided or how many households have running water, but which programs per peso spent are having the largest impact on reducing long-term poverty. And sort of the point here is there probably are some programs or some parts of the anti-poverty strategy that are working better than others. And so those are generally the parts that you want to identify and increase and cut back on others that aren't working so well. It's just sort of a fact when you're doing many different types of programs, some will be working better and others won't. So the sort of the basic idea is just like targeting resources to the poor, you want to target resources to the programs that work best. And to do that, you need more detailed evidence on which programs are most effective and which are really not doing so much, even if they have sort of good intentions. And the reason I say this is that the levels of poverty are still very high. Clearly in Oaxaca, there's still a lot of work to do. Resources, like economists say, are scarce and precious, and they should be spent on the best programs and cut back on areas where programs are less effective. So finally, the other area I'll mention, which is an area I work on too, so I can't resist, is I'm concerned about the area of education. So this is one area where over this period, I think the deprivations in education did not improve in Oaxaca. And I would say that education is sort of a big predictor of future poverty. So the strategy seems to focus on reducing poverty today, which is great. But we also want to invest in youth so as to reduce poverty of the next generation. So those are my comments, and thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to the rest of the panel and questions and discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Parker. We apologize for the technical challenges, but we were able to hear your presentation and really appreciate you being here. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Governor Alejandro Murat. Governor, welcome back to the Wilson Center. In my fairly short time here in the Mexico Institute, we've had a number of opportunities to engage with the governor and really appreciate the relationship we've built, your willingness to come and meet with us. So we're
This
delighted
is
to
the
have you here
interpretation booth.
today.
We cannot hear Mr. Rudman.
Okay. I think what I'll do is keep going, and we'll hope that we can fix the technical challenges. Governor Alejandro Murat is now, of course, concluding his 6-year term. He was elected to office in 2016. Prior to that, from 2004 to 2006, he was a federal deputy in Mexico's Congress, where he created and led the Special Commission for Competitiveness and Regional Development. He also served as general director of the Institute of the Registry Function in the government of the state of Mexico from 2007 to 2009, general director of the Mexiquense Radio and Television System, and general director of the National Workers Housing Fund Institute in Infonavit. He holds a Master of Law in International Relations from Columbia University, and as part of his postgraduate training, he specialized in corporate tax, financial, and property law, as well as in international banking and finance. Governor, again, it's really a pleasure to have you here at the Wilson Center. We're really looking forward to your remarks. You're welcome to do it from the podium or seated as you wish.
Thank you. Well, first of all, it's just an honor to be here at the Wilson Center, sharing the policies that in Oaxaca we implemented during this 6-year term as governor. I'd like to thank Andrew, Nabor, and Susan for giving us insights and the opportunity to have a good conversation about what we did first in Oaxaca, how we did it, and then what we can do going forward. First, I'd like to give you the context of what Oaxaca represents. Oaxaca is a state of around 4 million people. Half of them live in 13,000 localities of around 2,500 people. The other half of the population is concentrated in basically urban areas. Oaxaca also has around 1.5 million indigenous
We're sorry, we
people.
cannot hear Governor Murat.
Yes.
This is the interpretation booth.
So I'll just continue. We have 16 indigenous communities, and clearly Oaxaca is a very diverse state. So with this context, I'd like to also give you the idea of what my government implemented. So we had basically horizontally 5 pillars. The first pillar clearly was Oaxaca social policies. The second pillar was Oaxaca's economic policies. The third is Oaxaca's regulatory and efficient government policies. The fourth was Oaxaca's governability and security. And the fifth one was Oaxaca green policies. I would like to take as a given that in Oaxaca we have governability and security. So those are 2 elements that are, I think, fundamental to achieve any type of economic or social policy. Now, the other 2 are fundamental. I think that to have a successful poverty policy, you need to think about economic development. So that's what we did in Oaxaca. So let's start by analyzing the line under the poverty line. And that's where we focused on the social policies in Oaxaca. Because first we need to clearly think about the deprivations that Nabor and Susan already focused on, so that at least Oaxacans under the poverty line had access to the fundamental public goods that anybody requires. So in that aspect, we developed a program. And this program was focused vertically in two macro elements. So we focused first on global and regional development at that macro level, and then we focused on municipal and social programs at the micro level. And that's where we focused on our social programs, on the deprivations. Those two vertical pillars are fundamental to understand the Oaxaca strategy. Now, the Oaxaca strategy first started with the social programs. And as Susan mentioned, there we focused on some deprivations like access to nutrition. Oaxaca has one of the most important programs on communal kitchens and school breakfasts to help basically our communities and to give those communities, especially families, the possibility of using their income for other type of necessities. So that's an example of how we focused on some of the social programs. Now, the other one, which is, I think, very important, is the strategy of 40 municipalities. And that's focused on the municipal level, as I mentioned. So basically, we took 20 of the municipalities that had the highest level of poverty in Oaxaca. But as Nabor showed us, we also need to focus not only on the rural municipalities, but also on the urban municipalities. So the other 20 municipalities we focused on were the highest density municipalities in Oaxaca. So that's part, I think, of the success of our strategy to be able to reduce poverty. Now, what we were focusing on, and some of the information you need to know is, for example, that Oaxaca was the number one state in Mexico focused basically in basic housing services. We were able to reduce more than 200,000 Oaxacans in this basic deprivation by giving them the necessities of water services, of sewage, of electricity. Now, we also focused on housing quality and space. And we were able to expand more than 20,000 actions there in housing quality and space. Now, this is basically for urban, for rural municipalities. Now, when we think about urban municipalities, what we needed to do was generate a fund, because we have a federal fund for housing necessities, but we didn't have a fund for urban municipalities. And there's where the Oaxaca government focused on, and Nabor gave us some nice information. For example, Salina Cruz and Huajuapan, which are two important municipalities in Oaxaca City, were able to reduce more than 30% the reduction in poverty line. But we also heard Tuxtepec. That's a challenge we still face and we need to work on. So there we also focused on generating those type of public goods. Now, the other element that I think is very important is generating capabilities, because it's not only, as Susan mentioned, she analyzed education-wise, which I totally agree, and we need to have a better conversation on that. But in that sense, what we focused on was basically the two other elements I just mentioned, which are regional and global competitiveness. Now, what we did there is, first, we generated an ecosystem focused on microfinance. And what we did there is that we have the biggest guarantee fund in Mexico, 7% above any other state in Mexico City. We've been able to finance around more than $1 billion dollars in credits, and we've been able to give this to more than 50,000 people and companies. Now, we're also have a gender focus, so more than 50% of this microfinance was given to women, and around 15% were given to indigenous people also. So what we did was an ecosystem. We started with an area which generates capabilities, which is called ICAPET. Basically, this what serves people that don't have formal education. Now, after that, we also did the Institute of Entrepreneurial Areas. We did this all for all types of people, the ones that have formal education and the ones that don't have formal education. And then we did this fund, which we work with the federal government and one of their banks, which is called NAFIN. And that's the way we've been doing this microfinance. But that's not enough. The other thing we did was basically focus on the regional projects that Oaxaca required. There we've been able to invest more than $8.5 billion in which projects? Basically construction projects, which will serve Oaxaca in the medium and long term to maintain a high level of growth. But in the short term, clearly it also helps by generating jobs. And that's what explains that Oaxaca has been able to grow at 6.8% throughout this year. And throughout my administration, we've had positive growth. Actually, we were the highest state last year, in the last trimester, in growth. And we've had 6 trimesters of continued growth, which is very important. Now, the other element we used was also tourism, and that was part of the strategy in the short term. Why? Because clearly it requires very fast jobs. It creates very fast jobs. In that aspect, Oaxaca was, for us, it was a fast win, and we've been able to pass from 10% our GDP to more than 20% of our GDP. And let me just give you a practical example of what we did in that area. We constructed a convention center that has had more than 1 million people, for example, before the pandemic, and this year in the pandemic. And this has also resulted in more than 1 million passengers that we received in our airports. And that explains that Oaxaca's airport and Puerto Escondido's airport are expanding, and they are the top airports in growth right now in our country, especially Puerto Escondido. So this is another example of the way we've been able to focus to reduce poverty. So let me conclude very fast. First, Oaxaca was able to be the 3rd place nationally in the reduction of poverty. As Susan mentioned, we passed from 68% to 61.7%. It's a 6.3 decrease. Now, in extreme poverty, we were 2nd place nationally. And there we passed from 24.3% to 20.6%. Basically, it's around 90,000 Oaxacans that were out of poverty. Now, another element in this is social security access, because I think that when we think about Oaxaca and about the reduction of poverty, we also need to think about formal jobs. Clearly, Oaxaca in the south of Mexico has a very high level of informal jobs. But in that aspect, Oaxaca was the third place nationally that reduced the access to Social Security. We're talking about around more than 110,000 Oaxacans. And that also explains our strategy of economic growth. And this also impacted our municipalities. Let me give you another data which I think is very important. Basically, in this 6-year term, 83.3%, which is basically 475 municipalities, reduced poverty. And 77%, which is basically 439 municipalities, also reduced the extreme poverty indicator. So basically, those would be the most important indicators, the strategies that we used, and which explains why Oaxaca today has been able to establish a trend of poverty reduction. And like Susan mentioned, explains why, even though we confronted the challenges of the hardest earthquake in the modern history of Mexico, and clearly of modern history of Oaxaca, the pandemic, and more than 4 hurricanes, we were able also to reduce poverty and not increment it like it's the trend today around the world. And I'm very happy and excited to be here at the Wilson Center and to be able to share these policies for Oaxaca. And I hope that with all of the construction that we've been able to make, the competitiveness of Oaxaca has expanded. And the most important part, I think that not only in the present, but also in the future, we will be able to maintain the levels of growth that we've achieved today because of these structural constructions that clearly represent the most important aspect of public policies in Oaxaca. Not only the highways that will connect Oaxaca to the coast, Oaxaca to the Isthmus, but also the interoceanic corridor that projects more than 500 jobs, 500 million jobs, with an investment of more than 50 billion in the next 10 to 15 years. So I think that if this clearly becomes a reality, the best is yet to come for Oaxaca in economic growth and reduction of poverty. Thank you very much.
Well, I think the governor, I believe, has a bit of time to stay with us to continue the conversation, maybe take some questions. Reminder, if you are watching us online, you can email questions to mexico@wilsoncenter.org, or you can tag us on Twitter @MexicoInstitute. And our team will pass those questions along to me. If you're here in the audience and you have a question, just please raise your hand, and I will happily call on you.
Thank you. Thank you, Governor, for your speech, and thank you, Dr. Parker, as well. I don't know if you can. So I have a couple of questions.
I'm sorry, could you identify yourself?
Yes, my name is Sofia. I'm from Monterrey. I have a couple of questions. One regarding something that Dr. Thank you. The first regarding something Dr. Parker touched on. There were several programs, particularly social programs, that were removed during this administration: Prospera, Comedores Comunitarios, Estancias Infantiles. How did the state government mitigate, or what strategies did you use to combat this missing part of the federal government's programs? And particularly because we saw that it didn't, at the end, it didn't affect poverty reduction in the state. And the second question is if the increase in the health social deprivation, these 20 points, that are the only one we see that's drastically increasing, do you have any feedback on why this happened? Was it also something to do with Seguro Popular being removed, like the centralization of the health public policies in Mexico? And if you could elaborate a little on this. Thank you.
Yes, great question. Thanks. Basically, what we did is focus on what my government controlled as policies. Clearly, the most important part is the allocation of resources, financial resources, and the thing that explains the health deprivation is clearly Seguro Popular. Oaxaca was the highest state with beneficiaries. When you disappeared Seguro Popular, clearly you disappeared the opportunity to access the health services the way we would be able to analyze in this indicator. So I think that that's a challenge still going forward, but that's something I didn't control. It's a part of a federal strategy. The second, the other programs you mentioned, I maintained the communal kitchens, which clearly still is reflected in these indicators. And the other ones, the way we worked is that there's a federal fund for housing, which and services, which I used to do the correlation on the municipalities, as I mentioned. But this fund only serves rural areas. It doesn't serve urban areas. And the way we allocated the other part was that we made clearly a structural fund in my state to serve the funding to focus on the urban municipalities. And the part of estancias infantiles, I think it works, but I believe that it's not as relevant for the deprivation indicators, I think. What we did there was put the breakfasts on the schools to still help on the income side to working women, so that they could use their income for other necessities, and one of them might be to have estancias infantiles, which they could use in their localities. So basically, that's the way we were able to generate the balance. And the only area that I believe we were not able to do that transition as fast because of the pandemic was the health services. We had to focus the last 2 years of, as you know, all the resources to the challenge of the pandemic, so we weren't able to establish a program that could serve or rebalance the Seguro Popular.
Thank you. Regrettably, our technical difficulties have continued, so unfortunately we've lost Dr. Cruz and Dr. Parker. They may be watching us on the webcast, but we won't be able to include them in the conversation, Governor. We apologize for that and apologize to them and all of you. But in the remaining time, maybe we can continue the conversation. You talked a great deal about economic development, and in past conversations, we've talked about that. I wondered a question for you, and one that I would have asked of Dr. Parker as well, is maybe you could talk a little bit about the role of the private sector, the relationship between the public and the private sectors, both in terms of economic development and then in the context of poverty reduction, because most of what you talked about and Dr. Parker talked about, of course, were public programs. So I'm wondering if there's been involvement of the private sector in the programs, and then what your thoughts are on the broader relationship between the public and private sectors.
Well, definitely it's fundamental to have the private sector as a very important stakeholder. I'm totally in favor that the private sector clearly helps and does and has to do things that clearly the public sector won't be able to do as efficiently. The thing is that what we did first was basically establish a floor, or that's our objective today, a floor of a basic level of a poverty line. And from that point on, generate capabilities. And the first stage clearly is financial inclusion. What we've been doing is, with this fund that I mentioned, is that we've generated credit, but now we're working with the banking sector, the financial sector in Oaxaca and clearly in Mexico, so that this economic units that we have in Oaxaca, the next credit or financial requirement they have will be in the private area of the banking and financial sector. Clearly, this is financial inclusion, and that's, I think, very important. And we've been working with, for example, Banco Santander, Bank HSBC, and they've been very aggressive and very helpful. Now, other areas that we've been working on are more focused on generating the infrastructure or the right atmosphere so that the private sector can do the investments. But I think we're on the right track. Clearly, for example, one of the areas that I talked about was tourism, and the expansion that we've had from 10% to 20% of GDP explains because we've had more hotels, more new hotels that offer more restaurants. We have a very a trend right now in our gastronomical sector in Oaxaca, and the expansion of 2 airports that are fundamental. One is the Oaxaca airport, the other one is the Puerto Escondido airport. And clearly all of those areas are the most important stakeholders are the private sector. Now, we're also working now on the interoceanic corridor, and as you know, we will have there 10 economic zones. We will have a port and a train. And even though we will have the structure that's been that we've been working on will be administered by a public entity, clearly there will be permits and concessions so that the private sector, which are the ones that know and are better at administering the ports, administering the trains, and clearly the economic zones will be part of this equation. So that's the way we've been working. We've clearly had a conversation with them. And we also are focused on the local businesses, not only international businesses. And I think that one of the areas where we've been expanding the most is clearly the tourism. And now also agriculture. We're making the transition from normal agriculture to the agro-industry agriculture. And we're going to have the first agro park this year in Salina Cruz. And we've been also financing a lot of technology in different areas of our agricultural sector. And that's also the private sector.
Excellent, great, thank you. One of the points that Dr. Parker mentioned had to do with education. You sort of talked about poverty reduction in the immediate term, which is obviously essential, and then the long-term sort of building for the future. So I don't know if you wanted to maybe respond a little bit to that in terms of efforts to improve the education and build the future, ensure that Oaxaca has the labor force available for the future.
Yes, definitely. And that's, I think that we need to maybe analyze better what Dr. Susan mentioned. I would like to say that a very important focus of my administration has been education. First, as you know, a big issue of education was governability. Clearly, there was a rupture between the union
Right.
the teachers union in Oaxaca and the government since 2006, and then again in 2016 with another social event that we know as Nochistlán. What I did first was reestablish the conversation, the communication, and that has given us, for the first time, 4 complete school years that we hadn't had in more than 30 years. Also, we were able to disperse in job and labor requirements more than 100 million pesos that we were able to agree with the federal government, and that also gave us the opportunity to satisfy many of the labor requirements that hadn't been satisfied since 2006 to the teachers union. So we have a very stable relations. We have done a lot of investment. We also have made very big investments in the 10,000 schools that we have in Oaxaca. So you have the context. We have more than 80,000 teachers and 10,000 schools. And we've been able to establish all the investment that they require that hadn't been done because of this rupture in the last 10 years. We also have investments in the medium education level. We established the dual system of education with HIS, which is an entity from Germany, and we've been able to expand on the dual system. And the most important investment I think I've made in my administration is in the university level education, where we have made important investments. I think more than 100 million of investments in different universities. I expanded, and I'm going to leave 5 new universities in Oaxaca, including UNAM, which has arrived to Oaxaca. They are going to have 5 different options of education, and we've done the investment. I totally agree with what Dr. Susan said. The most important investment you have to make is education. That's why we did all of this. Let me give you some data, because that's also important. In the high university level, we have not the Benito Juarez University, but we have another public system called SUNEO. The indicator, which is CONEVAL, CENEVAL, we have all of the different options they give. We're in the top 3 in Mexico. For example, in infirmary, we're number 1. In international relations, we're number 2. Technology, we're number 3. We have an important Silicon Valley community from Oaxaca, from the University of La Mixteca. So that's something, it's not very well known, but CENEVAL recognizes this system as one of the top systems in Mexico.
Great. Thank you. I know we are really close to time, but I wanted to, before we conclude, I did want to ask, we've talked, obviously the focus has been on what you achieved in your administration, which is really quite remarkable, but maybe just as a final question, you can add some aspect of what advice would you give to your successor in Oaxaca or to other governors generally for how to ensure that these programs can be implemented and are sustainable, and that, I think there's always a challenge in any system, not only in Mexico. A new governor comes in and reverses or changes everything. And so I guess, what advice would you have for other governors or your successor? What are your thoughts on how to keep change that you've made sustainable, so that whomever is governor can build on the success of past administrations.
And I just wanted to, I think that when I did my presentation, I said 500,000 jobs in the interoceanic. I just wanted to, sometimes with the translation, some
Numbers
things
get
get
confusing, don't they?
confusing. Yeah. I think that the most important thing is that what's not measured cannot be changed. It's difficult to, when you lead in any area, I think, in life, to accept that you might not be taking the right decisions. Mm-hmm. And I think that the most important thing is that since I started my government, I told the Oaxaca people that the most important thing was that we were going to measure everything. Because that's the only way we can compare anything you do. And that's why it's so important to be here at the Wilson Center. That's why it's so important to listen to CONEVAL and to important intellectuals like Dr. Susan. Because when you measure, you can understand what you did wrong and what the opportunities are going forward. So if anybody asked, and I think that's a big, today we have this debate. I think that there are great social programs today in the Mexican government, federal government, but they're not being measured. And when you don't measure that, it's not, I think, the best way to invest, because I think that the scarcest resource we have is clearly financial resources and money, but the scarcest is when you, and you have to be scared, is when you use that money in a way that you cannot analyze what you're doing with that money. It's the cost of opportunity of what you are not doing right. And I think that's something that anybody that would ask me that will have this great opportunity or has any opportunity to be a public servant, I think the most important thing is to measure it. It's difficult sometimes because clearly you're not always going to have the results or the response you would like, but I think it's the best way to really help if that's what clearly you intend. And I think that's the biggest responsibility. And the other thing, I think that the best thing in public policy is to have structures, financial structures that can be maintained throughout time. I think that the best way to maintain this is if you have the capacity to have a financial structure like a fund, like I mentioned. Mm-hmm. And I think that is more complicated to take away because it becomes, I think, sort of a right that you will have as a community, as a population. So maybe to make this type of policies be maintained throughout time, if you have the allocation of those resources with some type of funding that is passed through Congress, I think that you can maintain the strategies going forward.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Governor. I want to thank our two panelists, apologize again to them for the technical difficulties, but thank Nabor Cruz from CONEVAL and Susan Parker from the University of Maryland College Park for joining us. I want to thank all of you online or here at the Wilson Center for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next program very soon. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.